Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert and advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts about the latest evidence-based trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each week, I ask just one burning question tied to current events. Our goal is to leave you with the tools you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. In our last episode, I gave a brief outline and history of the origins of Black History Month, and we chatted about some of the ways that you as an individual could celebrate Black History Month this February and beyond. Today, though, we're going to zoom out to the organizational level. Many organizations are looking to meaningfully and authentically engage in Black History Month, and the reality is that some companies do it better than others. So for today's Burning Q, I'm asking, how can organizations move past performative allyship and engage in anti-racism and equity work 365? To answer today's question, I'm joined by Colleen James. Hi, Colleen. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Hi, thank you, Melissa. Thanks for having me.
So Colleen is passionate about helping others learn and grow. With over 15 years of experience promoting inclusive environments in public, private, education, and not-for-profit sectors, Colleen has been able to blend her passion of education and diversity. As the principal consultant at Divonify, she provides equity, diversity, and inclusion training to organizations, companies, and individuals. And in her role as a professor in the School of Business at Conestoga College, she thrives on challenging her students to discover their inner resources, enabling them to better understand the realities and possibilities of their diversity. So, Colleen, the question is how can organizations move past performative allyship and engage in anti-racism and equity work 365?
All right, so it's a big question. I think first we got to start with what is performative allyship, right? And define what that is. So for me, and I think in the broader scheme of things, performative allyship and performative work by companies is when they're doing something to increase the social capital rather than the dedication to the cause. With that capital, there's a bottom line, there's a dollar figure. So companies, what we've seen and what we continue to see is during Black History Month, or during a major event that's taken place, all of a sudden companies say, okay, well, our business may be going elsewhere. We need to do something to stop that. So that's social. What do we look like on the outside? And companies for Black History Month, we see it all the time. They will all of a sudden, lots of representation in their promotions, in their ads. In some companies, they'll make a statement saying we support. I think about Blackout Tuesday, but are you really dedicated to the cause? And what does that look like from an organizational perspective? Does that mean 365, you're recognizing the contributions that Black people have done, the contributions that Black people are giving within your workspace? And are you showcasing that, but are you also including and having the conversations necessary to really address some of these critical issues, social and racial issues that are taking place? So we really need to start with, are you doing what you're doing because you really understand the complexities of what's happening and the erasure that's taken place? When I work with a lot of companies to address this, I actually have them audit themselves. Look at your social media. Who are you promoting? Who's following you? More importantly, who are you following as a company?
Yep.
And that's kind of a good place to start doing an audit on themselves, especially from that social context, the Instagram, the Twitter, all of that. And if you can easily say, wait a second, most of what we're promoting is not representative of racialized group, Black, Indigenous, et cetera. All right, why is that happening? And then if you've only had that one post in 6 or 8 months, or if you look back and say, well, we've only really showcased Black entrepreneurs or Black employees during that 1 month of the year, well, chances are there's some performative work that's taking place right there, performative activism, as we like to say. So it really starts with looking internally and looking at what you're pushing out, but it's also recognizing Black business, especially Black business 365, your Black employees having conversations. So a lot of what organizations are doing is, yes, they want to amplify Black people, Black or Indigenous people, but you're not really having the conversations with the employees. You're not having conversations with those stakeholders. You're not building the relationships that need to take place in order to really address some of the social justice and racial issues that are taking place.
Can you maybe tell us the difference between sort of amplifying versus actually engaging in authentic conversations? Because I think folks maybe don't know what the difference is, right? They may think that they're doing the right thing by amplifying.
Yeah.
But actually what you're saying is that there needs to be conversations. And what do those conversations look like?
Yeah, perfect example to illustrate this is when we think about solidarity statements that came, okay? Amplifying was right away, we're going to put out a statement, we're going to make all of these actions, we're going to hold ourselves accountable. But in creating that communication, did you have a conversation with your employees to see where are the gaps? What have we missed? What can we do? How can you as employees hold us accountable before making that statement, right? So that amplifying is, yes, you're amplifying, but there's that piece to it that has to do with how they look externally versus the internally. So I use that because it was so evident that you were amplifying the rights of and the injustices that have taken place against Black people, but then you haven't had the conversations to really say, well, what should we do? What are we doing wrong? Where are our gaps? Where are our blind spots? So it's just the talk, right?
Yeah.
So there's the organizations that do and those that talk about doing them. And I think to keep it on the simplest terms, it's like, have you been talking about doing stuff or have you actually been doing things? And employees know. They know right away because leadership in particular has not said, you know what, we recognize, we're seeing that there's issues. We've got systemic racism taking place within our organization. We haven't spoken with our employees. Have you taken the time to ask the questions, have those uncomfortable conversations to see what you can do so that it's tangible? So it's not just empty words that are being thrown out there. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, some folks may also be concerned because there's a lot of conversation around, especially for white folks, that there's a responsibility and onus on them to take a look inward as well and start to think critically about the role that they play. What do you say to the folks who are saying, well, I'm hearing that I'm not supposed to I need to do the work, but how do I talk to Black employees so I'm not upping the emotional tax or putting the burden back on them, right? I think there's a lot of confusion for white people around what to do. And so I'd love it if you could walk us through, what does that look like? How do you respectfully engage employees so that you're not asking them to solve the problem per se, but you're creating that dialogue? Maybe you can help our listeners understand that.
So it is a process, right? And when we look at leadership in organizations that are typically from a Canadian context, those people sitting around the table are usually white and doing some of the work themselves first. It's not looking for groups, racialized groups, Black staff to say, how do we fix our problem? Well, no. First, it takes that you're doing the work yourselves, that understanding, that education. And in some cases, that's where you may need to bring in that third party and ask those tough, necessary questions to really take a look at what are some of the practices that have been taking place within the organization. Because a lot of companies, there's a trust that's been broken because the conversations have never started and employees will not feel comfortable just coming and speaking to leadership. So it's really leadership doing the work themselves and then saying, okay, we need to have these conversations. And that means building a relationship, not to solve the problem, not for the racialized group to solve the problem, but to say, how can we address this, work together, and make sure that there's a relationship that's being built. It's looking inward first. It's really those leadership looking inward, looking at what they've been doing. And then sometimes it's meeting with racialized groups, but it's not to have them repeat their lived experiences, what they're going through, but it's more, we're trying to understand how we can do better. And we want you to be a part of this process, because I think there's historically been this trend that, well, we're going to create an equity and diversity and inclusion team, but then you don't have racialized, you don't have Black staff on that team, right? So what are you talking about? What are you doing? I firmly believe that in order for organizations to get things right and to start to get on that track to get things right, it really starts with building the trust and making sure that there's a relationship there. And that relationship is a direct connection to leadership. Leadership has to be committed and they have to show that they are committed. There's something called action bias where companies, they see, okay, well, we recognize there's a problem,
Right.
and they jump to the solution. And they don't, again, have the necessary conversations they need to have to really figure out what the problem is for their organization. So, for me, when I go into an organization, every organization is different.
Yep.
Some, there's such a lack of trust that even bringing in an external person, sometimes that has to be handled in a way that there's a trust component and an understanding that the person coming in is really trying to address the issues and to really make sure that the environment is a safe environment to really kind of drill down and building on that trust.
Do you think that it helps to have that third party involved, especially also obviously working with leadership is super important, starting there and having them understand and realize the importance and the role that they're going to play in actually making change. But then do you also recommend when you work, do you then work with the employees as well to help bridge that gap between leadership and the employees?
Absolutely. So I would meet with racialized employees, have that conversation, build that trust so they know that the outcome needs to be an outcome that they know is tangible, it's holding leadership accountable. And there really is, it's two pieces. It's meeting with the employees, but then it's also making sure that leadership is committed. And in some cases, Melissa, you're really trying to build a bridge that has been broken, right?
Yep.
Especially if we see years and years of systemic racism, discrimination taking place. So it isn't just top approach committing, but it's also making sure that employees know that if you're having a third person come in or a consultant come in, that the consultant is there to address the issues, to make sure that everybody is heard, that maybe historically hasn't been heard. And in some cases being that voice, because a lot of companies, as you know, Black employees, it could be one employee in some cases or two employees, right? And there's that feeling of if they say something, there's going to be repercussions because of that.
Yep.
So in some cases, it's really addressing the issues that maybe that staff person does not feel comfortable saying, or there's a systemic barrier where maybe it's the manager, supervisor who's creating that barrier for issues to be raised to leadership for them to really address stuff. So there's that component to it.
One of the things I keep thinking about and that we focus on our work is that there's no quick fix, and I think that that's the other thing too, is that it's like, okay, if I just put out this statement, we've dodged a bullet, we will do Black History Month and that'll show our commitment. And then we carry on with our business. And I think some of the things that organizations don't realize is that this is a long process. Like this isn't just sort of, we'll get people in 6 weeks, everything will be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely not a quick process. It literally is a journey and it continues. As you're aware, things in equity and anti-racism, things change very quickly. So for an organization to say, well, we've done this, usually if an organization has made that statement 8 or 9 months ago, and I will say, okay, show me that statement that you wrote. Right. And I'll be the one to say, what have you done since then? Well, we've been working on, no, well, you haven't done anything. Right. Yep. And your employees are holding you accountable. And if not, they know that that's when we get into that performative. Well, you just did what you needed to do to save face. But really, if you are for actual making change and addressing some of these deep-rooted systemic issues that are very deep-rooted, Melissa, I mean, these go back 400 years. So it's really showing that yes, we acknowledge we may be just starting this process, but that the process it's ongoing. We're not stopping because we've had training. That's not the case. We are making sure that within our practices, within our policies, we are making sure that we are continuing to revisit what we've said we've done, but also measure and track kind of, okay, so where have we come? And whenever we're addressing equity, especially equity, it's okay to be purposeful and have intent. If you know that you lack representation representation, you say, we know we need more representation. You can be absolutely committed to that and purposeful by saying it, calling it out and saying, you know what, we do need to hire more. Well, you know what, it's a process, but we're committed to it. So I think for some organizations, they want that, okay, we're going to come, we're going to do training, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But that's performative in itself too, right?
Yep.
Really is a back and forth, continuous conversations, continuous revisiting, and it's not a perfect fix. Sometimes you do something and maybe it wasn't the right way to do it. You know what? We need to come back and revisit it again. And I mean, you can't undo 400 years in 2 months. You
Yep.
can't undo it in a year. It's a process, and it's a continuous process.
So I have one final question. I know this is just one cue, but one more thing. When we think about how organizations can do the anti-race and equity work 365, there's a lot of conversations around what's the ROI of this? What are we going to get back if we invest in this? Or folks are thinking, well, how much do I actually have to invest? Unfortunately, this always comes back down to money. How do we quantify, or when you come across this with folks who are maybe engaging you as a consultant, what do you tell them? How do you talk about the importance of this investment? Because this is really an investment in your company and in the company culture. And I think there's a ton of hidden costs that organizations don't realize by not making equity and anti-racist work a priority in their organization.
Well, there's many, many facets to this, but first, employee turnover, right? It costs a lot to hire an employee, but also when your employees leave, especially your racialized employees, and I see that when they're leaving, that's costing the organization money. But the other aspect of this is you really want to have a culture, a corporate culture where everyone feels like they belong, where they can come to work, be themselves, so that if there is an issue that comes up, they don't feel like they can't say anything. And for a lot of employees, racialized employees, they are experiencing so much, if it's discrimination or lack of opportunities to advance, it's really making sure that there's that environment for employees to be able to, and I will come back to it, be their authentic selves, feel like they belong, right? Our organizations are supposed to be microcosms of the communities with which they're in, and they don't reflect that. And why don't they reflect that? And what is that doing to your corporate culture? And in terms of businesses that produce products, right? If you're leaving out a whole target audience, what does that say for your market and for your revenue, right? And I mean, it's not only that aspect, the receiving, but it's also helping to amplify, but also support Black business. And they always say, it's pretty well known, Black dollars don't stay in the Black community. But what can businesses do to help ensure that those dollars are being reinvested within Black communities, but also as well within their company? So it's so layered, but it's so
Sorry,
layered.
I should have had just one other cue and could have talked about that.
Just on that. But at the end of the day, for any leadership, they want their employees to make sure that they feel like they belong, they're valued for what they're bringing to the organization. So it's not just about the dollar figure, it's about that internal and that individual sense of value within that company. And it's very easy to, we hear about the companies who do not treat their Black employees properly, or their racialized employees, or even their marginalized employees properly. And that takes a deeper hit on a company than anything else. But if you are doing the work to make sure that you're leading with equity, you're leading by making sure that everybody feels valued, well, you can't really put a price on that, right? You really can't put a price on that. So it's bigger than just the return on investment from the dollar standpoint, but it's that I feel valued. I'm going into a place where I know that I've got access to opportunities, policies, all of that are applied in a way that is equitable for my individual needs. And I think at the end of the day, any business owner or anybody who's leading an organization, that's, talk about vision, mission, values. Well, the return on investment is making sure that everybody feels like they're valued.
Well, Colleen, you've given us a lot to think about. And I love the way you started with do an internal audit. So if you're a company, if you're sitting here listening and wondering, am I engaging in performative allyship? Start with that internal audit. you said, check out your social media feeds. Who's following you? Who are you following? And does everyone look like you? And that's a really good way to start to think about whether or not you're engaging in performative allyship. The other thing that you mentioned was talking to employees to get a sense of what the gaps are. And then for leadership, though, to really start to do that work and really thinking about whether you're equipped as a leadership team to do this yourself or whether you need to bring in a third party. Because what I think a lot of companies don't realize, and as you mentioned a number of times, is that this is 400 years of systemic racism and oppression, and it's going to be hard to undo yourself. And so having someone who is a strategist who can come in and help to lead you in doing that sort of internal work first, but then also creating that safe space for your employees to come and talk to you and to work on this together is going to be really important. So I want to thank you so much, Colleen, for talking to me today, for sharing your expertise. And if you're interested in learning more about Colleen and her work, you can connect with her at divonify.com. And we'll also have the link up on our podcast blog as well. And to everyone who tuned in, thanks so much for joining me on Just One Q. If you have any of your own burning questions, please feel free to reach out to me at hello@learningsnippets.ca or write us a review to let us know what you thought of today's episode. Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, and this has been Just One Q.